Hello, and welcome to this American History podcast entitled The Southern Colonies. In this podcast, we'll look at how the Southern Colonies of Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia were founded. As you've learned, the first permanent colony established by the English in the Americas was at Jamestown, which is in Virginia. And this colony, though it struggled at first, really thrived because of the tobacco industry and the agricultural opportunities it provided. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Southern Colonies. So the geography of New England was very different from that of the Southern Colonies. And as opposed to New England being very rocky and mountainous, the Southern region was the total opposite. It had rich soil and flat lands that would make it really ideal for large crops. And the climate in this region was also perfect for farming. It was extremely hot and humid, and the agricultural growing seasons were long as a result of this climate. And there would also be swampy lowlands and coastal areas that made it ideal for rice production. And the coastal area would make it ideal for ports and for trade. So the geography is going to play a large role in the livelihood that people are going to have in the Southern colonies. So the fertile land and milder climate of the Southern colonies made it possible to grow what are known as cash crops. And these are crops grown for sale rather than for use by the farmers themselves. So it might be items that you and your family aren't necessarily going to eat or use for survival, but things that you're going to sell in large or grow in large quantities so that you can sell to a mass market. So the main cash crops of the South were tobacco, rice, and indigo. And indigo is a plant whose leaves provide a source of blue dye for cloth. So it would be used for dyeing clothes blue. And tobacco thrived in the hot and humid growing season of Virginia and coastal Maryland. And rice was going to be well suited to the swampy lowlands and tidal areas of the coastal rivers in the Carolinas. However, the colonists had no experience in rice cultivation, so they depended on enslaved Africans who had been taken from rice growing regions in West Africa to farm the rice and ensure successful yields. And the largest port city in the South was known as Charlestown, which is called Charleston now. And as Carolina planters developed cash crop, Charlestown would grow as a port. And many plantation owners would live there part of the year to escape the isolation of their plantations. And again, plantations are extremely large farms. And although Charlestown became the fourth largest colonial city after Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, it never grew larger because English and New England shippers would control trade in the colonies. So without that strong merchant community, the city really failed to attract large numbers of new workers. And so the pictures that you see here is the harvesting of tobacco. And tobacco was extremely labor intensive. And really, this is much the same way it's been grown and harvested this way for centuries. But it was extremely labor intensive. So people in the South are going to turn to enslaved Africans to farm their land. And really, this was the way the South made their money, off of cash crops and the institution of slavery. 1/5 of the population of many parts of the South were Africans. And by 1770, some regions, half of the population could be of African descent or African American. And so, for example, by 1750, African Americans counted for more than 40% of Virginia's total population and more than half of South Carolina's. And in the South, more than 90% of the total African American population was enslaved. So slavery was extremely important to the economy of the Southern colonies. And here's a diagram of rice production. So it was an extremely labor intensive crop, which is really why it didn't didn't become one of the major crops in the South, and it died out because it really required a lot of slave labor, and it became really expensive for people. So, extremely labor intensive rice production is. So the government in the Southern Colonies is they were more likely to be royal colonies or colonies that had governors that had been appointed by the King of England. So the Southern Colonies were more closely tied to England and were generally supportive of the English government and of the Church of England. Um, Now, the colony of Georgia, which is right here, and I have that singled out, was a colony that was set up very differently. A man named James Oglethorpe envisioned a colony in which debtors and the very poor could make a new start for themselves. Um, King George II of England, he wasn't really all that interested in helping the poor, but he understood that Georgia could be a military buffer between Spanish Florida and South Carolina, which was really important moneymaker to the colonies. So Oglethorpe required that all colonists would follow three rules based on his own beliefs, and that would be no slavery, no liquor, and limited land ownership for each settler. His lofty vision did not last very long, and many of them found the colony's strict policies unreasonable. So a lot of people didn't actually enjoy living there. So the population of Georgia would grow very slowly. And eventually, those rules were lifted. Georgia had a significant slave population by the time of the Civil War. They did sell alcohol, and people would own very large plantations. So Oglethorpe's vision failed ultimately, and so that's the government of the Southern Colonies. Okay, so the institution of slavery in the South had led to the development of a social hierarchy in the South. So over time, wealthy planters would buy more and more land and ultimately more slaves, and that the result of this would that they would have additional profit. And so not all farmers would become wealthy, but the owners of the largest plantations became so wealthy and powerful that distinct classes formed among Southern farmers. And with their luxurious homes and lifestyle, rich landowners really did, their lifestyle resembled that of the nobles in Europe. And really, it was the institution of slavery that made this way of life possible. The work the slaves performed depended on really where they lived, but you can see from the hierarchy at the very top were people who owned large number of slaves, so 20 or more slaves. Then you would have smaller farmers that would have, about 1 to 5 slaves, and then you had poor farmers. This was the majority of farmers in the South. They had no slaves, and they were incredibly poor because their farms could not compete with the slave labor that planters were using. And then, of course, you had at the very bottom of the social hierarchy were enslaved people. They had no rights or freedoms. And so this hierarchy was made because of the institution of slavery. So while planters and small farmers benefited from it, enslaved people and poor farmers were very extremely disadvantaged by it. And just to show you how wealthy some of these people became, these are plantation homes in the South. And you can go and visit them today. A lot of them are museums, and they have tours of them. But you can see some of these look fancier than even the White House. So they became fantastically wealthy on the backs of enslaved people. And so that brings us to the institution of slavery and what life was like for enslaved people. So you've already read that on most plantations, enslaved people, both men and women, would spend long hours planting, weeding, and harvesting tobacco, rice, and indigo and other crops. Overseers or supervisors sometimes would use whips and harsh instruments and take measures to force workers to work harder or more productively. And some owners would recruit slaves called drivers to push their fellow workers to pick up their pace. Other slaves would work in the slave owner's household, and sometimes those conditions could be less brutal. Both men and women would cook and do gardening chores. Women would often take care of the children, both the slave owners and their own children. And some men had limited opportunities in the South, but sometimes could become artisans or skilled workers who crafted things by hand, and some women could become nurses or weavers. Unfortunately, enslaved women working in fields and house in the households were sometimes subjected to the sexual abuse at the hands of the male slaveholder. And this unwanted attention really reflected the American system of slavery, in which people were considered to be the owner's property, and the violence that would be committed against enslaved women was central to this system. Slaves would often have to build their own houses, which were typically one room cabins that sometimes had to sleep as many as 20 people, which is what you see right here in this picture. And people from different parts of West Africa would often find themselves just kind of thrown together on these large plantations. And in order to speak to each other, they would blend their African languages with some English. And so we'll get some English words that actually developed from African languages, such as yam and tote, which were introduced to the English language. And enslaved people would do what they could to cope with their situation, and many would actively rebel against their treatment. Some would resist the slave owner's power by staging slowdowns or faking illnesses or secretly destroying crops and tools. Others would run away. And some enslaved people became violent, killing the slave owners and setting fire to fields and homes. Armed rebellion would rarely happen in the North American colonies, and the thought of rebellion would send fear throughout whites in the American colonies. And the South Carolina legislature enacted harsh slave codes in 1740 to prevent revolts. The new code would make all enslaved people and their children permanent slaves. In addition, the code prohibited enslaved people from learning how to read and write. And in spite of these new laws, some enslaved people did learn to read and write, and they used this knowledge to tell their stories and let the world know what was happening to them. And so, in spite of everything that was happening to them and the horrific treatment that they were forced to endure, enslaved Africans and African Americans actually had a huge impact on American culture and colonial culture of the time, but also American culture today. In many ways, their music had a huge impact on the development of jazz and blues. They made clay, pottery, baskets, and musical instruments with African designs on them. They also would popularize new foods, including okra, melons, and bananas. In Boston, an enslaved man taught his owner the practice of vaccination, which he had learned in Africa. And as a result of this man's help, the city's people were protected from a smallpox outbreak. So really, enslaved people, despite what was happening to them, they were able to make important contributions to American culture. And so, this picture that you see here is this man's wearing what is known as a bell collar, and it was one of the worst forms of chains that could be put on someone. The bells would alert people if an overseer heard or stopped hearing the bells, they would know to start looking for this man. So the bell collar was particularly horrific. Okay, so there you have it, the Southern Colonies. So we looked at life in the colonies and how the geography of this place led to an agricultural economy, and how the institution of slavery would create a distinct social hierarchy in which wealthy planters were at the top and enslaved people were at the very bottom. So if you have any questions, you can always watch this again, or you can write down your questions and ask them in class. So I hope this helped, and have a great day.